Hi everyone, this is Rohit from Rice and Mossy, and today I'm excited to have Alex Louisy, who's a co-founder and CEO at Upflow, which is a B2B Saas company helping companies around the world improve their invoice collection process. Prior to that, he was the head of international operations and business development at Wifirst. Alex done his master's in finance from University of Melbourne, and a big thanks to Anto Chung from Lago for the introduction. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Rod. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Awesome. So you built a great company called Upflow, which is a B2B SaaS company. How did you get into this crazy world of startups?
That's a good question, because actually, like when I look at like people around me, like it's always been like a kind of a running joke for like a couple of years of, hey Alex, when are you going to stop talking about jumping into this crazy world and actually do it?
Yeah.
So I started my career in a very traditional environment. I work in corporate and investment banking, and then in a telco company for like 3 years. And I've always been like this big fan of like reading everything about TechCrunch and talking to a lot of friends in the startup environment. And I was kind of always like, I'll do it one day, but I didn't really have a proper like plan or anything. And I think, at some point I just realized that there would be no good time to actually jump into this. And I was like, let's do it. It was the right time in my life. And it was kind of an interesting moment for me, because I think that instead of trying to wait for the right moment, I just jumped into this and embraced it. And at the beginning, to be honest, I didn't really have a plan, but that was part of the process of jumping into this. Just jumping without a plan and spending the time to talk to people, think about ideas, meeting with other entrepreneurs, and it was a really productive time. So that's how it started.
Got it. Interesting. And you're also, head of business development at Wifirst. How did that opportunity come, and what are some of the learnings working at Wifirst?
Yeah, it's actually interesting that you talk about this, because it was a very, very different environment. Wifirst was a telco company, so we were selling managed Wi-Fi services. So to be honest, like super, super far away from any startup environment. And I think back at that time, it was kind of interesting because I was moving from investment banking and I wanted to go to the startup environment. And I thought, oh, let me do this intermediary step where I'm going to be a little bit in a more like hands-on attitude, but like not really in a startup environment yet. Truth is that at that time, I thought that I was an entrepreneur because I was a country opener. So it was basically like a French company, and they decided to go like in other countries, and I was like opening these new countries. And I thought that like, I was running my own little company within the company. The truth is that when you start your own company after, you realize that, making sure that everyone can get paid at the end of the month and other things like this, like, do you have a product, do you have a first customer, is actually much more of a struggle and a hustle than just opening a country when you have a company behind you. So that's how I got there. It was a super, super interesting experience for me, but definitely like something super different from building your own company, and we've been on that journey now for the last 4 years. So it's been an interesting journey.
Interesting, and there's a question I asked Anne as well, because they got into YCombinator, and Upflow is also part of YC 2020 batch. I think it's middle of the COVID that it happened, but how was the experience with YCombinator, and what were some of the learnings over there?
Yeah, YCombinator has been for us a very, very pivotal moment and key moment of our life in the journey of the company. So it happened at a moment in time when we realized that distributing in Europe our product was maybe not like the best thing to do for us, and we thought that going to YC would be just an entry point for us in the US market. What was super interesting when we got there was the fact that we've been super, happy and honored to be selected to be part of that program. But the reality is that we realized it was much more than only an entry point to the US market. And actually, like a lot of people out there were coming from other parts of the world and would just leave after YCombinator without necessarily like a willingness to enter the US market, right? I think we've learned a lot at YCombinator on a couple of things. One thing was, I think, was this idea of iterating super fast on the product and making sure that you actually build something people want. That's how they qualify. But I think a lot of times, like, and that was one of the mistakes we did at the beginning of Upflow, like we were very focused on our product, but not necessarily very focused on what actually people wanted out of our products, if you see what I mean. So YC helped us like really like think about this retroactive loop in a matter of weeks, not in a matter of months or whatever. So that was super, super important. And I think the second thing we learned by being in YC is that, and we were the kind of last batch before COVID, right? So it was January to March 2020. So it was kind of the crazy moment. But the fact that both my co-founder and myself went for like 3 months renting a small flat in San Francisco and spent 3 months, 24 hours a day, only talking about a company. Oh, nice. I wouldn't say that like it's a great experience, because sometimes you just get a little bit, it's a little bit too much, but it was such a key moment in like how we behave today and how we built like solid foundation for the future of the company that like it's something that we will never forget, even though it did not really end the way we expected, because, demo day was basically the moment where all like, borders were closing down and the world was collapsing and stuff. So it was, there's a lot of stories about this, but, other than this, because hopefully COVID's not going to come back in the future, for other founders, this is a big recommendation for me, because for them, because it's been really like a game changer for us in our journey at Upflow.
Oh, very, very interesting. But did you get on to do the demo day later on, or was it? Oh, was it?
It was like it was crazy, because YC applied to themselves what they were telling us. So basically, they were changing things like as the situation would evolve, right? So at some point they say, oh, we're going to do demo day, like it's going to be like virtual, and then they said, no, there's not going to be any demo day. It's only going to be, we build a software to replace demo day and stuff. And so in the end, it was just like they created this big network where investors could actually connect with companies based on the presentation that we would make, but it was recorded. And it's been kind of crazy, because like we had many people reaching out. And we spent nearly like 1 month just right after demo day, just talking to investors, and in this middle of the moment of the world where everyone was just like saying that this would be like the end of the world, basically. So it was a really, really weird moment. But yes, we did a strange demo day, but it was a demo day indeed.
Interesting. And you've been part of investment banks, as well as you're part of Wifirst, but what was why did you want to build Upflow? What was the problem that you so wanted to solve?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. The starting point for me was really like, we talked about like getting into the startup world, and it was really like, how do we apply things that we've seen in the kind of more traditional world, but with a more modern approach. And when I was working in investment banking, I used to work in what we call structured finance. So we used to structure those big financings for very large companies. And I remember that like, it was a very like slow process, because it would take us like a lot of time to do this analysis. And I remember one thing was that we said, basically we have a threshold that we can't lend to companies that are doing less than 10 million in EBITDA, just because if it goes smaller than this, then we can't really analyze properly what's going on. And it was quite interesting, because I was looking at this and saying, well, we can't analyze because we don't have the data, but the data is there, it is somewhere. And originally what I wanted to do when I jumped into this kind of startup environment was, I've always been into like very interested about fintech, and I was trying to apply the financing principles that I had in my kind of like financial background and studies, but actually like applying it to smaller companies where we could leverage like more like a fluid data that we could get on a day-to-day basis. And there were a good example of that in the US that were not really existing in Europe. The truth is that fast forward, I spent 6 months trying to build a company working on financing for SMEs in Europe. And I started interviewing a lot of finance teams, a lot of CEOs, and a lot of people that were in this environment. And I realized that oftentimes when people wanted to get some financing, the main reason why they wanted financing, short-term financing, is because they just couldn't get paid on time by their customers, and they needed the money to actually like finance their business, pay their bills and stuff. And it struck me at some point to just take a step back and say, well, why is that we are still in, at that time, 2018 or 2019, and it's still so hard for B2B companies to actually just collect the payment, right? And that's how, like, over time, we evolved around this idea that was a very natural starting point for us. And that was later the starting point for Upflow to say, well, before financing those companies, let's first help them get paid. It doesn't seem that sexy or that crazy, but the reality is that it's a much more natural and pragmatical step, like first, and then we'll see if we finance it. And that was the beginning of Upflow. And the interesting part is that as we started digging into this topic, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about this, but we realized that it was much more complex and much deeper than what we anticipated in the first place. And 4 years later, we still haven't started doing the financing, and I can tell you that there's still a lot of things to be done on B2B payments to help this company get paid. So that's it's been an interesting journey for us.
Interesting. You talk about B2B payments. So why are the current B2B payments so outdated? And is it across the world, or is it specific to developing countries, and or some of the developed countries doing a better job on that?
I'm glad you're asking, right? Because the truth is that when you talk to people around you, no one is really telling you that it's outdated, right? Like if you talk to experts, they will tell you, but if you sit down like next to a finance team in any B2B company, like a consulting firm, a construction company, or even a B2B tech company, right? They will tell you that's the way it is. They're not going to tell you it's outdated, right? And the truth is that you look at like and it's one of the key tenets of like what we're trying to do here at Upflow, but we're not the only one. Like it's a common trend around the professionals working in the space. But if you look at like all payment verticals, whether it's consumer, online, subscription, like even retail as well with Square, like all of them has been revolutionized in the last 10 years, right? 10 years ago, like when you would go for a drink with your friends, you would exchange money with them with cash, or maybe with a check, or maybe with a wire transfer. And now you're probably using Venmo, right? Or PayPal, or any new solution, right? And the thing is this, like, if you look at this, like Square, like in the US, you're just going to use your phone to just touch the terminal and just pay and just go, and you don't even know how it's working. But the truth is that in the B2B space, in the US, people are still using checks, 40% of B2B transaction in checks, a piece of paper in an envelope, right? And the thing is that you say it's crazy, but they don't say it's crazy. They say that's the way it is, right? And you're not necessarily happy when you receive a check, but you're not gonna, just gonna jump and say, "What? I got a check," which is actually insane. Yeah. And when you think about this a little bit deeper, like we can say, well, we don't use checks in Europe anymore if you live in Europe. But the point is that receiving like a PDF in your mailbox, which is actually called an invoice, having to open it, copy pasting like all of the details into your banking interface, and then wiring money 90 days later and stuff. If you think about it, this is total nonsense, right? When you think about the world, in the world of API, and you don't need to be like a crazy engineer to think about this, but in a world where everything is interconnected, receiving this money on your bank account and then manually matching it, it's just like this overall process is totally inefficient and it needs to be changed. So what is interesting is that it's a very, very slow moving space. There's a lot of different players, a lot of different like tools. There's a relationship as well between customers and vendors that is not helping at all. And so it's a slow moving thing, but it's definitely moving to a space where we say, well, in 10 years, it's quite unlikely that people are still using checks or wire transfers to actually like pay. And that's the vision we have with Upflow, is not only like to solve how they manage their order to cash cycle today, but also bringing them into, like I'm sure you've read the book Crossing the Chasm, but we want to bring them to like the stage where we believe the world is going, which is currently done by early adopters, but in the future it will be for everyone. So that's the positioning we have with Upflow and why we're building it.
Interesting. And you know, especially when it comes to sales, you're always looking out to get the best of customers. But how did you get your first big customer? If you can talk a little bit about the story and how did you manage to get them?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and first of all, like I hope that for all funders or people that are listening to us today that are pre-product and like it still don't have any customer, like I always remember those moments where you have your first paying customer and you have someone that trusts you to actually spend some money. Yeah. And I would say that like the way we structured the product in the early days of Upflow was not super scalable, and we had people that would actually pay for it. But in the end, maybe like 2 years later or 3 years later, when we look at it, we said, well, was not necessarily like the ideal customers that we would want. And the first big customers in which we had like really confidence that this would be like the right approach were probably when we entered the US and when we started seeing like this kind of real fit between the product and the market. And I always remember this kind of shift between the European mentality and the American mentality about buying software. And I always remember like this first big customer we had. It's a company called TripleByte, and I'll always remember that because it was the very beginning of YC, and we were reaching out to founders in the environment. And I remember this French entrepreneur called Guillaume, who's the co-founder of TripleByte, and he was just interested into helping. And we talked a little bit about this right before the podcast about like giving back, and he was really giving back. It was just like, how can I help? And I was telling him a little bit about like the product we were building and stuff. And he said, yeah, after 20 minutes of conversation, we were walking around and doing a walking meeting because of COVID, actually. I remember we could go and do this. And he was telling me like, hey, I think I really like what you guys are doing, but you should talk to our finance team because that might be interesting for them. And at that time when you don't have a customer and stuff, you're just like so excited about it. And that was the first time that we had this really fluid process where the person was really interested. There was very limited requests on the product. It was not like, oh, okay, but I need this and this and this to use it. It was just like, okay, let's give it a try. And I remember sitting down with my co-founder, and we were wondering if this would work and stuff, but it worked. And they were happy with the product, provided a lot of feedback. It was the first, massive paying user in the US. And for us, that paved the way on like the GTM later. So it was a good story that started with, some people that are here to help because it was about giving back. But then turned out to be like a strong ambassador of our product later down the road. And we were super, super happy about it. And that's a feeling that I will never forget, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that's a super interesting story. Also knowing that, he's ambassador of your product, which always leads to a lot of references. Interesting thing you pointed out that, you made a lot of mistakes early in your company. And you're working as an investment banker, and you started, this is your first startup. And especially for listeners who want to build their own company, what are some of the mistakes that missteps they should be careful about and not look at repeating it, especially if they're the first time founders?
Yeah, especially as first time founders, this is something that I underestimated when we started Upflow, is the fact that I think that second time founder have a specific edge, which is that they've already done a couple of mistakes. And on our side, like, I think we could write a book on like all the mistakes that we made. So, it might take us like 2 hours to go down all of them. But I think, if I had to pick one that could be helpful for other founders, one mistake that we did at the very beginning of Upflow is that I think we were too much focused on the product itself. I think it's very easy to kind of think about like talking about like what your product is going to be, how great this idea, like the features, how it does not exist on the market. But I think even when you interview people, you kind of lack this this push that actually YC is extremely positive about, which is actually like have your user testing your product and get this retroactive loop like as soon as possible. Don't wait for another month. Don't wait for another year. Don't wait for the next release. Just ship it, even if your shipping is just actually like a design or a slide or something on which, or MVP that is not perfect. Don't wait for this big thing to come up, because chances are that like you're building something that no one really wants. Yeah. But the only way to find out is actually like having your users experiencing it, asking people if they would be willing to pay for it. You know, if you're in, especially if you're in B2B Saas, like you know that you're gonna have to monetize that at some point. For us, it was such an interesting moment where we actually moved out from the free product to actually having our users to actually pay, because this is when they see the value. This is when they actually give you the real feedback. And overall, my piece of advice on this is don't wait. You know, YC is telling you like we only have 3 months to get to a big goal and you can make an impact, because it's not going to be an impact in 2 months. It's going to be an impact next week. And you would be surprised to see what you can do in a week when you start thinking about like, what can I deliver next week? So that would be my number one advice, because I think overall we spend too much time like kind of talking about how great the product will be without having it in the hands of our users. Overall, that would be my number one mistaken advice.
Got it. Interesting. And I want to talk about hiring. You know, hiring so important in startups. But do you prefer to hire more senior, experienced people or young hustlers with more energy, especially, you know, if you're when trying to scale up your business?
Look, it's an interesting question, and again, it relates to probably some of the mistakes that you make. Right? It's I think in the engineering side, like you have this saying around like, you know, the 10x engineer, which is this idea that like sometimes one engineer can do the work of 10 others just because she's like extremely good at like what she does, right? Yeah. And I think that the one thing that is like the constant struggle that you have when you start your company, especially if you are in a kind of a VC-backed hyper growth type of mode, and if it's what you want, which is not necessarily what you want, but I think the constant struggle is that you don't have time, right? You don't have time. And you always think that like it's going to be efficient to hire more people with, you know, like great hustling mind and mindset and stuff. But the reality is that like it had so much overhead at the beginning of your company, and it takes so much time and energy to realize that you're not necessarily going in the right direction. That if I had to do it again, I think I would start with a much more senior team just from the beginning, rather than you know, trying to think, okay, we'll hire the senior people later on. Because the reality is just like if you have a few of those 10x people in the room, you can really achieve great things. And that's something that I think would make a difference. That being said, right, you have to be realistic about what you can do and what you can't do. Usually the 10x people are, you know, they ask for a super high salary or super high equity, and maybe you don't have that, right? And so I think at the end of the day, like the story of the startup is about surviving, right? You just want to make sure that like you can make it another day. And I'm not saying that like this, the only way to do this is just to assemble the best people and just wait for this to happen. But if I had to do it again, I think I would be much more senior in my approach than what we did in the early days of Upflow. And that would be my piece of advice. Yes.
Interesting. That's really interesting. And any big, you know, hiring mistakes that you've done, and you know, has it changed your approach to team building?
I think one of the mistakes that you do when you start scaling your company, I mean, we've done that a little bit, is maybe delegating too early the hiring. And I think in general, like delegating is something that can be quite dangerous when you start going to this phase where you move from this very small core group of people I remember when we raised the Series A of Upflow, we were a team of 13 people. So it was really, really smooth and, and intense, and we all knew each other. And then suddenly, like, now we are a team of 70, and a lot of things get diluted, right? You just like, sometimes you see people in interview, but you only see them for like 20 minutes. And it's like, oh, that's the co-founder interview. That's the last step. And, you just say hi, you ask for a few questions, and then you move on. Yeah. And the truth is that you realize that even if your company is 70 people, like 70 people it seems like, a lot when you start, but it's not that much, right? You still know everyone. Every single function is just like 3 or 4 people in a way, right? And I think you should spend that time to assemble the best team, because that's what is going to make or break your company ultimately. Like I always tell the team that, like, when you get to post product market fit, right, it's really more about like how you scale the organization than trying to figure out like if you have a good product or good customers. If you don't have them, like, it's going to be the job of your team to actually find the right customers, the right pricing, answer the right questions. So it's really about the team. And I think like as founders, you should 100% spend a lot of time on interviewing and making sure that like you're not delegating this too early, because little things can go off the way pretty quickly. And related to that, one of the other advice that I would give to other founders, and it's not my advice, it's an advice that I got from other founders that were really, really far away, like ahead of us in terms of the journey, was just making sure that you clarify your values or operating principles as early as possible. Because oftentimes you can think about like, oh, these are the values, like only like the large companies have those, and that's like the 4 values that are on the wall and no one really reads them and stuff. But the reality is just that your organization is somehow specific, and you want to make sure that people understand what is required to work in this organization, and what is like things that you can bring that are totally like different, that is totally cool. But there's a couple of things on which you don't want to compromise, and you want to make sure that these things are super clear within your group and for people that would actually join. And that would be like my piece of advice, which is also linked to the other one, on which, well, your role is to stay involved in this, but it's to stay involved on making sure that those operating principles apply and that they are enforced. And this has been a big part of our job at Upflow over the last couple of months as we started growing the company.
Interesting. You talked about values and knowing the principles. How do you make sure that the team understands the value? Do you cover few days, some time during the week to talk to your leadership team about those values? How do you make sure that everybody in the team understands and actually applies those values?
I have this thing at this running joke at Upflow, but I'm not the only one saying that like, as a CEO, I'm the chief repeating officer. And I think, that's at some point it becomes your job, right? When you think about those kind of like core and fundamental things of your business, typically the vision, where are we going 10 years from now, the operating principles, how we operate, I think it's your job to actually like make sure that like you reinforce them on a regular basis. And I was about to say on a daily basis. So I think if I have to answer your question, I think it's very important that like you clarify those as soon as possible. This is something that I've learned the hard way as well from my previous experiences, where there was not a clear understanding of how do we want to work, what are the kind of things that are expected from people, or things that we don't tolerate, So being clear on this is extremely important. It's not easy. We spent a lot of time in workshop with the team, making sure that like it's not something that is like totally top down from the founders and just like kind of something that everyone can embrace. And then once you have clarity, which is not easy, it's about like making sure that like this is not something that you just write on the wall and then forget about and stuff, but actually like some things that you actually use on a day-to-day basis. So for example, if you go on a career page at Upflow, you will see that even before you apply, you can read about our operating principles. Is that going to be as clear as when you join? Probably not, but at least you know what is expected from you, right? When you go through the interview process, there is going to be questions or specific parts of the interview that are relating to that. And once you join, we train you on these operating principles. And then again, on a daily basis, every time I'm giving feedback to someone, and every time we are giving each other's feedback, we try to actually link this feedback to one of our operating principles, because it usually comes down to something that is pretty standard. So I think the way to answer your question, I think it's a lot of leading by example, but also repeating those like on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes you feel like a little bit of a broken record, but I think that's my job, and that's our job as founders.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I really like how you mentioned keep repeating. Obviously, you need to keep repeating the vision to the team all through it. And I've been into business development and the revenue part of it. So I'll ask about the revenue leaders. Well, when do you think is the right time to hire your first revenue leader or your sales leader, and what are some of the core signals to understand you've hired the right person?
Yeah, that's not an easy one. So when you talk about revenue, I think I don't know if you're talking about someone that is encompassing the entire revenue function. So usually for us, it would be like when you think about like a CRO type of person, and we don't have that person currently at Upflow, right? We're still the highest person in terms of like impact we have on the revenue function is our VP of sales.
Right.
And he's covering like our outbound functions and our account executives. So, generating opportunities and then closing business. And I think, for us, I don't know, maybe I'm not the right person to advise, because, maybe you invite me again once we have a CRO and we are a very successful company that went through like all the steps of like distributing at scale. But I think for us, like if I go back to, seed is about like having a good idea and a good potential team, but not necessarily like customers or anything. If you get to Series A, it's usually when you have evidences of a product market fit, like actually good companies actually using your product in a kind of a repeatable way, but it's not proven yet that you can repeat that. I would say that like right now we at Upflow, we are between Series A and Series B. And it's really about like scaling this engine, right? It's not about figuring out like if our product can be used by people. It's about like how can we make sure that like we have repeatable patterns and demonstrating that we have repeatable patterns to distribute it, right? So that goes like all across the funnel, from generating opportunities, closing business, and then having a great retention on those accounts. My feeling of that is that as long as each of those functions is not properly functioning, so meaning that we have a formula for that, the chief revenue officer should still be the founders, right? And it's me for now, right? And it's really my goal to make sure that like those functions one by one work before we hire someone that oversees like this entire function, and that I can go and retire, which is my dream of like looking at the company working. I'm just kidding, but it's just like I know that I will always be busy with the company, and there will always be things that needs to be fixed and rolled. But that would be my approach to this. And I think it's easy to kind of think, especially when you just raise some money, like you're gonna hire like someone that is going to solve all of your issues. The reality is that you still know a lot about the history and why you're building this company and how we approach like selling the product. And I think it's important that you keep your like a foot on the ground and just making sure that you understand one. So that would be my approach. But again, I think people that are more advanced than me would have maybe other advices on when to hire a CRO. So that would be my answer.
Very interesting. And Alex, I quickly want to the top three. What's your favorite business book?
My favorite business book is, we talked a little bit about Guy Kawasaki before starting this, but I'm going to choose another book. One of our operating principles at Upflow is called we radically own our duties, and it's this strong sense of ownership. And one book that really changed my life in this is called Turn the Ship Around. I don't know if you've ever read that book. It's a book that has been written by someone in the army called David Marquette, and it's actually telling how they turned like one of the worst submarine in the US Marines into becoming like one of the best ones, and by not necessarily like changing the people or changing everything, but actually like turning the ship around, which means like empowering people to actually think about like what they do, what are their duties, and how it created like a much more powerful organization within this submarine. And I really encourage you to read that book if you haven't, and if you're interested into building an organization. This is not necessarily like a business book, but more like an organization book, because it's been really enlightening for me in terms of how we are building Upflow today. And how I wish like a lot of people would build a company, because I think it's a great way for people to feel empowered and actually more interested about their job, which is sometimes I think a challenge in today's life, where people take this kind of 9-to-5 job and are not necessarily interested anymore. So it's been a really great book, and I highly recommend it.
I haven't read that book, but I'm definitely going to, read it, buy it, and we're going to put that in the show notes. And
Great.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And if you could go back in time when you started Upflow, what is the one thing you would have focused on or done anything differently?
I think I would have focused more on our users. It's like coming back to my advice that I gave you earlier. I was like, we were too focused on our product. I'm not the product person at Upflow, but I'm a very big fan of like well-crafted, well-designed product.
Thanks.
And I think like it was really like the thing where we spent like weeks and months like thinking about how great the product would be and stuff. And we did those interviews, but I think like one of the things that we figured out in the end is that everyone is happy to talk to entrepreneurs when they don't have a product and telling them how great their ideas are. And yourself, like you have this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where they say, oh, that's great. So you say, yeah, I know, like that's my idea, so it's great. And then the reality really hits when you actually try to go back to these people with your real product and say, hey, do you want to use it? Do you want to give it a try? And they say, oh, actually, like I'm a little bit busy these days. Maybe later. And then suddenly you realize that these people that you interviewed were really nice, but it was not necessarily like answering one of their needs, right? And having again like this strong focus, it took me a long time to realize that when we talk about product market fit, it's really like a product meeting a market, right? And you want to find this kind of fit between the two. And everyone's just like, yeah, product market fit. That's when like, you sell your product. But it's actually like finding like building something people want, like in a way, like, YC puts it, is so difficult, so hard, that this should be your sole focus at the beginning of your company. And I'm super thankful to YCombinator for that, for like pushing this emphasis on really focusing on this kind of fit between those two, because I think we wouldn't be here without them. And anytime I see a founder talking about like ideas and stuff, I'm always telling them like, hey, don't only think about the product, also think about like how you're going to distribute it, how are you going to be in front of your users, how are you going to collect your feedback from your users as soon as possible, because I think that's the most important thing when you want to just get something that might be successful. I'm not even talking about something that will be successful, but when you realize that most of the startups are just failures, and because that's the reality, you realize that if you want to survive, you really need to talk to those users. So that would be the number one thing that I would have focused on much earlier in the process if I had to do it again.
Got it. Yeah, focus on the customers. That's a great advice. And do you have any favorite online tool? For example, Gmail, Slack, Zoom.
We're big fans of tools at Upflow, and trying to make sure that like we are as productive as we can. So we use a lot of them, and we're pretty. I think when people join, they're always like kind of like, oh my god, there's so many tools that I need to use. One that has been really like a game changer in our organization, and I know that we've done that quite early, is using Lattice. So I don't know if if you know about them. It's a people management type of software where there's a lot of different things in there. Initially, we hired Lattice for the 360 reviews because we invest a lot in how we communicate and how we give feedback to each other. But I think it's been key for us in especially like implementing like OKRs. So, this objective key result methodology that is always like a kind of a great ideas, but if you don't have the right tool to actually implement it, it just doesn't work. And for us, it's really been a game changer, and I highly encourage people, Lattice being one of them, and there's others, but thinking about like using this type of software to when your team starts scaling a little bit. I remember when we had our OKRs on Post-it on the wall, when we were the 5 or 6 of them, that worked really well. But it doesn't work when your team is just hitting like 30, 40, 50 people, when you have full remote people. And it really helped us achieving like clarity around our goals as an organization. And it's really been a game changer for us. So kudos to the team at Lattice, and a good piece of advice that I can share with others.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I've heard about Lattice, and it's a great tool. I'm going to put it in the show notes. Alex, what is the best way people can reach out to you and know more about Upflow?
I think, I'm trying to be, I'm also a big fan of Superhuman and the inbox zero methodology. So, I receive like tons of emails, but you can send me an email and I'll get back to you. I'm trying to give back as much as I can. I'm not saying that I can give back on anything, but you can just reach out to me at alex@upflow.io. Not too much on LinkedIn. I'm trying to get like I'm an email person, so the email version is the best way to reach out.
Got it. We'll put that in the show notes. Alex, thank you so much for taking the time speaking to us. I really enjoyed my conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Roy, for having me, and I hope this was helpful for others. And again, if there's any follow-up questions or anything on which we can help, please reach out, and good luck with your podcast. And thank you for taking the time to share the stories. Thank you so much, Roy.
Thank you.